Hello, my name is Michael Lakey. I'm the tutor for the module TMM2051 New Testament Studies, and in spring term 2022 we're going to be looking at two bodies of literature in the New Testament. The first will be the Gospel of John, which we'll study in weeks 1 to 5, and then the second will be 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which we'll study in weeks 6 through 10, although one of those weeks will be our Saturday study day. And so this first video is for week 1, and you hopefully just have seen Dr. Gooder's excellent introduction to the Gospel of John and to a lot of the literary and authorship issues attached to John's Gospel. Hopefully also you'll have had a chance to read the two pieces of assigned reading that were given to you. In particular, the Christopher Skinner article. This gives me pause to mention to you a few books that you might consider looking at. You don't have to buy them. In fact, probably best not unless you're really interested in building up a biblical studies library. We are going to talk in subsequent weeks about commentaries, and especially commentaries that will be useful for those training for ministry, in particular for activities of teaching and preaching. But the books I want to mention to you this week are as follows. So this first one I'm going to mention to you is the first edition of the Cambridge Companion to the Gospels, which was edited by Stephen Barton. This is the Cambridge Companion series is an excellent series of introductory volumes that tackle different aspects of an important subject, and there's a good essay in here on the Gospels of John. While we're about it, the Christopher Skinner essay, which is on which I've asked you to read on Moodle, is found in the second edition of this volume. And second edition is a little bit deceptive. It's an entirely new book with entirely new contributions from a range of scholars, most of them who didn't contribute to the first edition. And so actually, if you're interested in getting these books, some of you might be, either of them is good. The first edition gives you a good overview of scholarship for about 15 years ago, and the second edition gives you a good introduction to scholarship now. Finally, there's this seminal work, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, by Professor Richard Bauckham. Now, Richard Bauckham is a splendid Gospels scholar who has produced, I think, one of the most interesting arguments in my lifetime working in New Testament, and it relates to the genre of the Gospels. So we might imagine that by talking about the Gospels as eyewitnesses, Professor Bauckham was doing that sort of old style apologetic work, and I'm sure that his work could be used in that direction, but that's not what it's for. What he's doing is he's talking about eyewitness testimony being essential, or rather claims about eyewitness testimony being essential to the genre identification of the Gospels. And genre is what literary category do these works fall into? And Bauckham argues that key to the early church's designation of the Gospels as Gospels was this idea that they were attached to eyewitness testimony somehow. And that's important. That's an important it's an important literary as well as historical observation, and I'm chiefly interested in the literary aspects of this, partly for reasons of agreement with Professor Gooder, with Dr. Gooder, that lots of the historical questions attached to the Gospel of John are not just unknown, but they're technically unknowables. So that there are some things we're never going to get the answer to, and yet we still read. And so that for me is why Professor Borkham's work on the Gospels and eyewitness testimony is so crucial. It gives us a literary category, a literary classification to put around the idea of gospel. There are a host of other books that we could talk about, but we really need to get onto the topic today, which is the structure of John. By way of a little preamble, a few words about gospel structure. It's important to recognise that there are many bodies of literature in the ancient world which identify themselves or are identified epigraphically as Gospels. So in addition to the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, we've got a whole series of non-canonical Gospels. And the fact that they were non-canonical Gospels doesn't mean that they weren't read, and read widely. And there's quite a bit of stylistic variation. If we look at the canonical Gospels, what you see is the canonical Gospels have been described by one wit as a passion narrative with an extended introduction. And that's largely true of all of the canonical Gospels. They have several chapters to do with the death, and in the case of Luke, Matthew and John, the resurrection of Jesus. In Mark, the resurrection is mentioned, reported, but there are no resurrection sightings. So the canonical Gospels have a few chapters devoted to that, and then there's an extended build-up to that in terms of a description of the ministry of Jesus. And the ministry of Jesus can be long, or can be short, can have lots of discourse materials, can have mostly deeds. There's quite a bit of variation. There's also quite a bit of literary dependency between the different Gospels. But if we take Mark as a template, I'm going to open a little window on my iPad here so that you can see. If you take Mark as a template, there's almost like a you can describe the story of Jesus in Mark graphically. So here we are. I'll choose a pen. The story of Jesus in Mark has a few high points. There's the baptism, where the Spirit of God descends on Jesus, and there's the voice, "You are my son." There's the transfiguration and the confession by Peter at Caesarea Philippi, in which Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One." And also Jesus is revealed in his glory. Then we've got the crowd welcoming Jesus at the gates of Jerusalem, at the triumphal entry. And then we've got the centurion at the foot of the cross. Four declarations in one form or another of who Jesus is. And then if we overlay on that kind of the ups and downs of Jesus' story, it starts moderately high with stories of prophetic fulfillment. This Jesus is the one who fulfills Isaiah and Malachi. And straight after the baptism and the temptation, we start quite low. He reveals himself, but what he is someone who's a teacher, centered in the northern province of Galilee, doing therapeutic miracles like casting out demons and healing people. Then there's the crowd and a block of teaching known as the kingdom parables. And at every stage in this first part of Mark's Gospel, you have people asking, who is this? Who is this? Who is this? Who is this? And then after the kingdom parables, you have a whole series of what one tradition of scholarship calls nature miracles. And these are the kinds of things like miraculous multiplication of food, walking upon water, stilling storms, and all of that sort of stuff. The sorts of things that only a god would do. And then you've got the declaration at Caesarea Philippi, you are the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One, followed by the Transfiguration. And what's interesting about these nature miracles is the nature miracles tend to be done in the presence of the disciples, and the disciples tend to echo the crowd by asking, who is this? Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. As soon as the disciples come to faith that Jesus is really the Messiah, there's a dip in the mood and tone of the Gospels, because Jesus starts telling them that he's going to Jerusalem in order to be crucified, and they don't believe it. So the story of the first part of Mark is the story of the disciples coming to faith. The story of the second part of Mark is the story of the disciples being disillusioned in their faith, but still persisting with Jesus. At the entrance to Jerusalem, this is the point at which the crowd are most animated in support of Jesus, although it's interesting that the crowd here don't use the same Christological title for Jesus as is mentioned at the baptism, or is mentioned at the Transfiguration, or is mentioned at the foot of the cross. You get key events. I'm going to put that key event in blue. You've got the cleansing of the temple and a whole series of controversy stories. So back to red. And so there we are, hovering at this kind of middle to high. There's lots of controversies in this period. There's the final meal, there's the betrayal of Judas. Then there's the crucifixion. And at the foot of the cross, you have the centurion. Surely this man was the Son of God. And so you can see how what you've got is a nice up and a down, developing and maturing understanding of discipleship faith in Mark, which is almost like a full story in sequence. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that we might be tempted to treat events in this part of the story and events in this part of the story slightly differently. Here we have theme number 1, here we have theme number 2. Theme number 1 is all about coming to faith. Who is Jesus? Theme number 2 is disillusionment. Jesus has come to not just to be the one who fulfills our hopes, but also to be the one who isn't quite what we expected. And then Here we've got all of the events of Holy Week and the crucifixion and resurrection beyond. And so Mark's story reads almost like a developing faith narrative, with a growing sense of who Jesus is. And note that key controversy events like the cleansing of the temple are at the very end, where Jesus finally shows himself in Jerusalem. One of the characteristic things about Mark is that geographically there's a direction from north to south, from Galilee to Jerusalem. And so there's a faith journey, there's a geographical journey, and then there's a journey of revelation in Mark, and theologically that fits together quite nicely. Now let's open a new thing there. Right. Okay, so John is different. I can't get that to go white, I'm afraid. John is different, so I'm gonna draw John in white. John isn't doing the same thing at a literary level with his story. Rather, John's story is built up around a series of events which are signs. I'm not going to fit them all in, but John's we might imagine each of these sign events as being an illustration of something to do with John's Christology. So we've got water into wine, we've got the feeding of the 5,000, we've got the raising of Lazarus. Now we'll be looking at the raising of Lazarus later in the course. And each of these events, is almost like a semi-enclosed vignette. Then, after that, you've got the grand event of the Passion narrative, which includes the betrayal, the trial, the resurrection. Before that, you've got a theological introduction, the prologue. But over the top of that, you've got a layer of other themes. So, for instance, alongside signs as key terminology for understanding the Gospel of John, there are also these declarations that Jesus makes, where he says, "I am," and it's usually "I am something or other." I am the bread of life. I am the true vine. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the gate of the sheep. These are moments where Jesus discloses in words as well as in deeds who and what he is, and these "I am" sayings are very important for understanding the Gospel of John. Now it's interesting that not all of the signs have an accompanying "I am" saying. So, for instance, the very first sign, the transformation of the water into wine, there isn't a reference. Jesus doesn't say "I am." In fact, he's quite clear with his mother, "My time has not yet come." But the signs are there, in the words of John 2, to reveal his glory. He revealed his glory and his disciples put their trust in him. And so some of the signs don't have accompanying "I am" sayings, And some of the I ams don't have accompanying signs. So, for instance, in the farewell discourse, which lands in the Passion narrative, there we are. In John chapter 15, you have I am the true vine. I am the true vine. Now, that isn't accompanied by a sign. I mean, we might argue that because the water into wine was telescoped into the beginning of John, that the true vine saying matches that. Who knows? But either way, what it reveals is it reveals that the signs, here they are, these signs, and the I am sayings, which are peppered in a different layer of the text, in the discourses of the text, that they represent related but compositionally distinct layers of the Gospel of John. Also, there isn't a gradual realization of who Jesus is. So either on the part of his opponents or on the part of his disciples. So, for instance, the cleansing of the temple, which appeared towards the end of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, appears at the beginning of John. What that means is it means that there isn't a gradual build-up. There isn't a gradual build-up. It also means that that there isn't a single geographical line going from north to south in John's Gospel. John has Jesus go backwards and forwards to Jerusalem, popping up at a festival here and retreating there, going through Samaria at this point, going back to Jerusalem another time. And what that means is it means that that it's quite difficult to put John and Mark or Matthew or Luke side by side and identify a straightforward set of relationships here. Theologically, the narratives are doing slightly different things. There's a theological aspect to the composition of the narrative in Mark, where geography, faith development, and messianic revelation all follow the same kind of Galilee to Jerusalem and then to the cross path. Whereas in John opens with, sheer revelation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and both the I ams and the signs, in different ways, through narrative picture and through discourse, they attest to the fullness of the revelation in Jesus Christ. Bam! From the beginning of the Gospel. And so John has a completely different theological as well as narrative feel from Mark. And John's feel, it rather feels if Mark is like a movie where you have gradual development of character and plot and revelation, John is like an art gallery where you have a series of more or less finished compositions that you move from one to the other, to the other, to the other. And John, for that reason, feels quite iconic. And by that I mean that the signs are a little bit like icons, things that you see through. But it also feels, in terms of pacing, quite stately. And I think that's important. I think that's important for judging the structure of John. Now, this structure, I'm going to do it. This structure. There's one more. This structure, we might think of 20th century scholarship tended to think of John as the book of signs. There we are. And then the Passion. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Followed by an epilogue and preceded by a prologue. But I'd like to, but I think weaving into that are the various extended discourses and I am sayings that form a kind of editorial overlay. And so whilst we can see that John, as Dr. Gooder said, bears some of the signs, no pun intended, some of the signs of being the result of an editorial process, and whilst we can say that, you know, some of these divisions are there in the Gospels. There's definitely signs. There's definitely passion. There's definitely prologue, and there's definitely epilogue. And there's definitely a layer of discourses that more or less permeate all of these. I don't think that we can know who did this, and I don't think that we can be absolutely sure what its developmental stages might have been. What we're left with is something which at a superficial level has much more in common with the other canonical Gospels than it has with the non-canonical Gospels, many of which aren't even in narrative form, but which at the same time has a radically different feel. And I think this is something that Paula mentioned in her presentation. So I've talked now for about 27 minutes. I'm going to go now. I take that off share. So I hope that was instructive. This is something that we can talk about on Wednesday, but in terms of the structure of our John course, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be spending a bit of time. I'll just put it back onto there. Looking at the prologue. So we're going to spend a week on the prologue. We're going to do some work on signs. We're going to do some work on the Passion, but we're also going to do some work on the I am sayings and the discourse materials. And the aim is that we'll have a chance to see some of the different ways in which themes which are established in the prologue and enacted in the signs, described in the I ams, and decisively performed in the Passion, how that gives John a deep theological unity despite some of the complexity of his structure. And so he really is doing something different, I think, from the Synoptic Gospels. So I'm going to take us off share screen, and I'm going to bid you adieu, and I shall see you all on Wednesday. God bless.